US pilots are seeing things that should not exist. Objects with no wings, no signals, no known flight pattern, appearing inside restricted airspace. Radar tracks them. Infrared follows them. Then they disappear without warning. These are elite aviators, trained to identify everything in the sky, reporting the same impossible encounters again and again. Why are these sightings rising? Why now? And what is moving freely where nothing should be? Routine flight notes that slowly change their language. In military and civilian aviation, written records are built around repetition. Pilots file weather observations, fuel data, navigation notes, and brief descriptions of anything unusual. Most entries follow predictable formats. For decades, objects that could not be identified immediately were usually absorbed into standard categories or left unresolved without further comment. They appeared briefly in logs and then disappeared into archives. During training exercises off the coast of Southern California in November 2004, radar operators aboard the USS Princeton began noticing recurring tracks that did not behave like conventional aircraft. According to later testimony and release summaries, these contacts appeared at high altitude and descended rapidly without clear transitional phases. On November 14, two A-18F Super Hornets from VFA 4-1 were directed toward one of the contacts. Chemdar David Fravor and Lieutenant Chemdar Alex Dietrich were among the pilots involved. Both later stated that they observed a small white object above disturbed water. No transponder signal was detected. Infrared footage was recorded by another aircraft later that day. At the time, the encounter was documented through internal Navy channels. After-action reports and sensor data were reviewed within classified systems. No public statement followed. Similar procedures had been used for decades. Unusual tracks were evaluated, categorized when possible, and stored. Most were attributed to sensor artifacts, atmospheric effects, or known aircraft once additional information was available. A decade later, pilots flying from Naval Air Station Oceana and Naval Air Station Chambers Field began reporting repeated sensor contacts during training off the Atlantic coast. Between 2014 and 2015, aircrew members described objects that appeared on radar and infrared systems while they were conducting routine missions. Some pilots also reported visual observations. Two short infrared recordings from this period were later released and labeled Gimbal and Go Fast. Ryan Graves, a former F/A-18 pilot, later stated that sightings were common enough that they became a topic of informal discussion among squadrons. He described instances where objects appeared to remain stationary against strong winds or moved in ways that did not correspond to known aircraft profiles. Graves emphasized in public interviews and testimony that pilots primarily viewed the issue as a safety concern, especially during high-speed training. In earlier decades, pilots who encountered unexplained contacts often relied on informal reporting. They might mention the event during debriefings or note it briefly in flight records. There was no unified office dedicated to collecting and analyzing such reports. Responsibility shifted between intelligence units, safety offices, and operational commands. This structure made long-term pattern tracking difficult. The office's procedures emphasized documentation rather than interpretation. Incoming reports were logged, assigned reference numbers, and reviewed using sensor data, satellite imagery, and intelligence databases when available. Analysts compared timestamps, locations, and technical parameters with known activities, including training exercises and commercial traffic. Many cases were resolved through this process. Others remained open because of incomplete or inconsistent data. In March after this release, Congress directed the Department of Defense to standardize reporting procedures. Aircrew members were instructed to submit observations through designated systems. New guidance emphasized consistency in timestamps, sensor references, and location data. In 2022, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office was established to manage these reports across air, sea, space, and land environments. In 2024, AARO published an unclassified historical review, summarizing its examination of earlier programs and long-standing claims. The report described how archives were searched, how interviews were conducted, and how past investigations were evaluated. It concluded that available records did not support certain persistent allegations. Much of the text focused on administrative methods rather than specific incidents. Later that year, a consolidated annual report covering fiscal year 2024 was released. It stated that 757 reports had been received during the reporting period and earlier. The report separated newly occurring incidents from older cases that had been submitted retroactively. It also noted that many had been resolved as balloons, drones, birds, or sensor artifacts, while others remained unidentified due to limited information. These figures reflected a change in practice. Reports were no longer scattered across unrelated offices. They were centralized, reviewed using shared criteria, and summarized at regular intervals. The language used in official materials was restrained and repetitive. Phrases such as insufficient data, unable to correlate, and likely conventional appeared frequently. From the pilot's perspective, many encounters were brief and technically ambiguous. A radar return might appear for several seconds and then vanish. An infrared track might register without producing a visual target. Weather layers, temperature inversions, and electronic interference could affect readings. In congested training corridors, multiple signals overlapped. Distinguishing one source from another was often difficult in real time. Flight safety manuals stress conservative interpretation. Pilots are trained to assume that unknown contacts may represent aircraft until proven otherwise. This approach reduces collision risk, but also increases the number of uncertain entries in reporting systems. Over time, this produces large datasets containing mixed quality information, ranging from well-documented incidents to brief, fragmentary observations. Interviews with aviators conducted between 2017 and 2023 show a consistent pattern. Many stated that they did not view their experiences as extraordinary. They described them as technical anomalies that deserved review. Several emphasized that earlier reporting systems discouraged detailed submissions, either because of administrative workload or concerns about professional reputation. Standardization reduced some of these barriers. Civilian pilots have also submitted reports through the Federal Aviation Administration and NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System. Some describe unusual lights, radar contacts, or visual objects at high altitude. These reports are stored separately from military databases, but follow similar documentation practices. Most are resolved through follow-up analysis involving weather data, satellite tracks, and air traffic records. What changed gradually was not the presence of unexplained observations, but how they were handled. Instead of remaining isolated notes, they became part of larger databases. Instead of being discussed mainly in private, they were summarized in public reports using neutral language. The emphasis shifted toward record-keeping, cross-checking, and long-term storage. The records that exist today consist mainly of timestamps, coordinates, sensor outputs, and short narrative descriptions. They reflect routine aviation work rather than dramatic encounters. In many cases, the most detailed information remains classified. What is visible is the structure of a system designed to collect and filter uncertain data without attaching interpretation. For pilots still flying training routes and operational missions, this system now forms part of daily work. Reports are filed alongside weather notes and maintenance remarks. Some entries are resolved quickly. Others remain open, marked by missing data or conflicting readings. Over time, they accumulate quietly in databases that most pilots never see. The process continues in the background, shaped more by procedures and checklists than by any single encounter. The Atlantic Training Corridor and repeated sensor tracks. Along the eastern seaboard of the United States, Navy aviation training is concentrated in defined offshore zones. These areas extend from the coast of Virginia and North Carolina into the Atlantic and are used for carrier qualification, air combat training, and weapon systems testing. Aircraft from Naval Air Station Oceana and Naval Air Station Chambers Field routinely operate in these corridors, often at high speed and in close coordination. By 2014, several squadrons flying from these bases began noticing unusual tracks during routine missions, observed contacts on radar and infrared sensors that did not correspond to known aircraft or scheduled activity. Some of these contacts appeared at altitudes and speeds inconsistent with typical civilian traffic. Others seemed to remain in place despite prevailing winds. These observations occurred during standard training sorties. Crews were conducting air-to-air exercises, navigation drills, and carrier workups. In most cases, the encounters were brief. A track might appear on the display for several seconds or minutes and then disappear. Sometimes, it reappeared later in the same general area. Visual confirmation was uncommon, but some pilots reported seeing small objects or distant lights. One of the most widely discussed recordings from this period is known as the gimbal video. It was captured in January 2015 by an F/A-18 using an infrared targeting pod. The video shows an object moving against the background of clouds, with audio from the cockpit indicating pilot reactions and sensor readings. Another recording, labeled Go Fast, shows a fast-moving target over the ocean, later analyzed to determine its apparent speed relative to the aircraft. These videos were initially circulated within military channels. They were reviewed by intelligence and technical specialists and stored in classified systems. In 2017, they were made public through media reporting and later confirmed as authentic by the Department of Defense. Their release brought attention to a period of frequent reporting that had previously been known mainly within naval aviation. Ryan Graves, who flew with Strike Fighter Squadron 11 during this time, later described repeated encounters over a period of months. He stated that some pilots experienced similar sensor contacts on multiple flights. According to his account, the objects were often detected at high altitude before descending rapidly into lower airspace. He emphasized that the issue was treated seriously because of collision risk. Internal safety and intelligence reporting procedures required pilots to document these events. After landing, crews submitted flight debriefs and sensor logs. These were reviewed by squadron leadership and forwarded when necessary to higher commands. Some cases were correlated with known activities, including weather balloons, commercial flights, and military testing. Others lacked sufficient data for resolution. One factor affecting analysis was the increasing sophistication of onboard sensors. By the mid-2010s, Navy aircraft were equipped with advanced radar systems and infrared targeting pods capable of detecting smaller and more distant objects. This improved sensitivity also increased the likelihood of detecting clutter, reflections, and atmospheric effects that older systems might have ignored. Weather conditions along the East Coast added further complexity. Temperature inversions, moisture layers, and coastal winds can influence radar and infrared performance. Maritime traffic, fishing vessels, and offshore platforms also contribute to background signals. In congested training zones, separating meaningful tracks from environmental noise is a persistent technical challenge. Pilots interviewed in later years observations. Reports might be sent to safety offices, intelligence units, or operations departments, depending on local practice. By 2015, concerns about recurring contacts led some squadrons to request additional guidance. According to later congressional testimony, pilots were encouraged to report incidents more consistently. This coincided with broader efforts within the Department of Defense to improve collection of anomalous data across domains. Analysis conducted after 2015 involved comparison of sensor logs, flight paths, and external data sources. Investigators examined satellite imagery, air traffic records, and meteorological information. Some cases were attributed to distant aircraft, unmanned systems, or balloons. Others remained unresolved because of missing or incomplete records. The Atlantic Corridor reports also included instances where multiple aircraft observed the same contact. In such cases, data from different sensors could be compared. These events were considered higher priority for review. Even then, technical limitations sometimes prevented definitive identification. In official summaries released after 2020, many East Coast incidents were grouped into broader statistical categories. They were described in terms of altitude ranges, sensor types, and resolution status. Individual narratives were rarely included. The emphasis was on aggregate trends rather than detailed reconstructions. For pilots involved at the time, the experience was often described as routine but unresolved. Flights continued as scheduled. Training objectives were completed. Reports were filed. In most cases, no follow-up information was provided to the aircrew. The events became part of background operational experience rather than focal points of discussion. Over several years, The accumulation of similar entries from the same region drew attention from higher levels of command. This contributed to later decisions to centralize reporting and analysis. The East Coast Training Corridor became one of the most frequently referenced areas in public discussions of naval UAP reports, from squadron reports to central review offices. Before the mid-2010s, reports of unidentified aerial observations were handled primarily at the unit level. When pilots encountered unusual radar tracks or visual objects, the first step was usually a squadron debrief. Aircrew members described the event to intelligence officers and operations staff. Sensor recordings were downloaded and stored. Written summaries were entered into local systems. In many cases, the review process ended there. Each squadron maintained its own records. Some forwarded selected reports to regional commands. Others kept them on file unless a clear security concern was identified. There was no single database that collected all reports across the Navy or Department of Defense. As a result, similar incidents occurring in different locations were often analyzed separately. During the period between 2014 and 2016, East Coast squadrons submitted a growing number of sensor-related reports. Some of these were shared with Carrier Strike Group, intelligence cells, and Naval Aviation Headquarters. Analysts compared them with known training schedules, radar calibration data, and intelligence assessments. When matches were found, cases were closed. When no explanation emerged, files were archived. At the same time, parallel reporting systems existed in other branches. The Air Force, for example, maintained its own safety and intelligence reporting channels. Civilian aviation relied on the Federal Aviation Administration and NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System. These systems were not fully integrated. Information exchange depended on personal contacts and informal coordination. In 2007, the Department of Defense had established the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, commonly referred to as AATIP. The program operated with limited funding and focused on evaluating potential threats. It reviewed some historical reports and commissioned technical studies. AATIP ended in 2012, and its functions were not immediately replaced by a comparable centralized office. After AATIP's closure, responsibility for unidentified phenomena shifted between different defense organizations. The Office of Naval Intelligence, Air Force intelligence units, and other agencies handled reports relevant to their missions. This distributed structure continued for several years. In 2017, media coverage brought renewed attention to earlier Navy encounters. Reports in national newspapers described the 2004 and 2015 incidents and included interviews with pilots. The Department of Defense later confirmed the authenticity of released videos. These developments increased public and congressional interest in how reports were managed. In response, the Pentagon established the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force in 2020. The task force was placed under the Office of Naval Intelligence and given responsibility for coordinating analysis across services. Its role included collecting reports, reviewing sensor data, and preparing classified briefings for senior officials. The task force introduced more standardized intake procedures. Units were encouraged to submit reports through defined channels. Templates were developed for documenting time, location, altitude, sensor type, and environmental conditions. This improved consistency across submissions. In June 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its first unclassified assessment on UAP. The report summarized data collected by the task force and partner agencies. It highlighted the lack of complete information in many cases and emphasized the need for better collection methods. The report also noted that several incidents occurred near military training areas. Following the report, Congress included language in defense authorization legislation requiring the Department of Defense to expand its analytical capabilities. Lawmakers requested regular briefings and public summaries. They also directed the creation of a permanent office with broader authority. In July 2022, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office was formally established. AARO, Maritime, Space, and Terrestrial Domains. The office was tasked with developing unified reporting systems and coordinating across military and intelligence organizations. AARO implemented centralized databases that allowed analysts to compare incidents across regions and time periods. Reports from squadrons, ships, radar stations, and satellites were entered into shared platforms. Automated tools were used to identify recurring locations, sensor patterns, and operational contexts. The office also developed procedures for historical review. Analysts examined archived records from earlier programs and commands. They interviewed former officials and reviewed classified files. This effort was intended to determine whether past investigations had overlooked significant findings. In March 2024, AARO released the first volume of its historical record review. The unclassified document described how records were evaluated and how earlier claims were assessed. It emphasized documentation standards and verification requirements. The report concluded that many claims could not be substantiated with available evidence. Operational reporting continued in parallel. Squadrons submitted new cases through secure portals. Intelligence officers verified metadata and attached supporting files. Cases were assigned analysts who coordinated with other agencies when necessary. Resolution categories were updated as new information became available. One practical effect of centralization was improved feedback to units. In some instances, squadrons received explanations based on later analysis, such as identification of commercial drones or weather-related phenomena. In other cases, reports remained open, with no further updates provided. By fiscal year 2024, AARO and partner agencies had received hundreds of new submissions. The consolidated annual report released that year reflected the maturity of the centralized system. It presented statistical summaries, resolution rates, and methodological notes. Individual operational details were largely omitted. For pilots and intelligence officers, the shift meant that reports were no longer isolated within local files. They became part of larger datasets reviewed by specialized teams. Documentation requirements increased. Forms became more detailed. Sensor calibration data and environmental records were more frequently attached. The process did not eliminate uncertainty. Many cases still lacked sufficient information for definitive identification. What changed was the structure surrounding them. Reports moved through consistent pathways. Reviews followed standardized steps. Archives became accessible across agencies. The handling of anomalous observations became an administrative function embedded in routine defense operations. What the annual reports actually contain. Public reports on unidentified anomalous phenomena are structured around administrative requirements rather than narrative detail. Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Defense, and are released in response to congressional mandates. Their primary function is to document how many reports were received, how they were processed, and how many were resolved. The format of these reports has remained relatively consistent since 2021. Each document begins with a summary of reporting periods and the agencies involved. It then outlines the collection process, the analytical methods used, and the categories applied to individual cases. Technical descriptions are limited. Most sensor data and operational details remain classified. The first unclassified assessment, released in June 2021, covered 144 reports collected between 2004 and 2021. It divided cases into general groups, such as airborne clutter, natural phenomena, and foreign systems. The report stated that only one incident had been confidently identified as a large, deflating balloon. The remaining cases were described as lacking sufficient data. Subsequent reports expanded in scope and detail. After the creation of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office in 2022, annual publications began reflecting broader data collection. These later documents included reports from air, maritime, and space domains. They also distinguished between incidents that occurred during the reporting year and older cases submitted later. The fiscal year 2022 report noted an increase in submissions following new reporting guidance. It emphasized that improved awareness and standardized channels likely contributed to higher numbers. The document included tables showing altitude ranges, geographic distribution, and sensor types involved. Individual incidents were not described. The fiscal year 2023 report continued this approach. It stated that many cases were resolved through correlation with known objects such as aircraft, balloons, drones, and weather phenomena. It also noted that unresolved cases often involved limited sensor coverage or incomplete metadata. The report stressed that unresolved did not mean unexplainable, only that available information was insufficient. In November 2024, the fiscal year 2024 consolidated report was released. It stated that 757 reports had been received during the covered period and earlier. Of these, several hundred occurred within the most recent fiscal year. The report separated incidents by domain and included resolution statistics. A significant portion had been closed after analysis. Others remained under review. Each annual report includes a section describing analytical methodology. This typically outlines how reports are entered into databases, how supporting data is collected, and how analysts compare incidents with external information. Satellite imagery, air traffic control records, meteorological data, and intelligence databases are referenced as standard tools. Another recurring section addresses data limitations. Reports frequently note that many cases lack high-quality sensor recordings, multiple viewpoints, or precise timing information. Some incidents are based solely on pilot observations without supporting technical data. Others involve sensors operating at the limits of their detection capabilities. The language used throughout the reports is deliberately restrained. Phrases such as unable to resolve, insufficient data, and likely conventional appear regularly. Speculation is avoided. The documents focus on process rather than interpretation. Geographic information is presented in broad terms. Regions are usually described by command areas or general coastal zones. Exact locations are rarely published. This reflects both security considerations and the limited usefulness of precise coordinates without accompanying technical context. The reports also include sections on interagency coordination. These describe how AARO works with the Federal Aviation Administration, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, National Reconnaissance Office, and other entities. The goal is to compare military observations with civilian and scientific data sets. The effectiveness of this coordination varies depending on data availability. Historical analysis appears in separate publications rather than annual summaries. In March 2024, AARO released the first volume of its Historical Record Review. This document focused on past investigations and claims. It described archival research and interview procedures. It did not provide new technical findings related to recent incidents. Classified annexes accompany most public reports. These annexes contain detailed sensor data, operational context, and intelligence assessments. They are provided to select members of Congress and relevant committees. Their contents are not released publicly. One notable feature of recent reports is the emphasis on training and guidance. Several documents describe efforts to educate pilots and operators on reporting procedures. This includes briefings, online portals, and standardized forms. The reports suggest that improved training has increased both the quantity and quality of submissions. Another recurring theme is technology development. Reports mention upgrades to sensor systems and data fusion tools. These improvements are intended to enhance detection and identification capabilities. Specific technical specifications are not disclosed. The reports do not include personal accounts or direct quotations from pilots. They rely on aggregated data and institutional language. This reflects their purpose as oversight documents rather than investigative narratives. Over time, the annual publications have become more detailed in terms of structure while remaining limited in substantive disclosure. Tables and charts have expanded. Methodological explanations have grown longer. Incident descriptions have remained minimal. For readers outside government and defense institutions, the reports provide an overview of administrative activity rather than direct insight into individual encounters. They show how many reports exist, how they are processed, and how often they are resolved. They do not show what most pilots actually saw or recorded. What emerges from these documents is a picture of sustained data collection and cautious public communication. The focus remains on accountability, consistency, and compliance, with congressional requirements. Technical uncertainty is treated as a normal condition, rather than an exceptional problem. Each annual report functions as a snapshot of institutional practice during a specific period. Together, they form a record of how unidentified observations have been documented and managed over time. They reflect evolving procedures more than changing conclusions. Inside the sensor systems that capture these events, Modern military aircraft and naval vessels rely on layered sensor systems to detect and track objects in the air and at sea. These systems are designed to operate together, combining radar, infrared, electronic support measures, and visual inputs. Each system produces different types of data, and each has technical limits that affect how objects are recorded. Fighter aircraft such as the FA-18 Super Hornet are equipped with active electronically scanned array radar. These radars transmit and receive radio waves using thousands of small modules. By adjusting the timing and direction of these signals, the radar can track multiple targets simultaneously. It can operate in air-to-air, air-to-ground, and surface search modes. The radar display seen by pilots is a processed representation of reflected signals rather than a direct image. Radar performance depends on many variables: range, altitude, weather conditions, and the size and shape of an object all influence detection. Small objects with limited reflective surfaces may appear intermittently. Atmospheric effects, such as temperature layers and moisture, can bend or scatter radar waves. In coastal regions, reflections from the ocean surface can create false returns known as clutter. In addition to radar, Navy aircraft use infrared targeting systems. These pods detect heat differences between objects and their surroundings. They are primarily designed for targeting and navigation, but are also used to observe unidentified contacts. The infrared image is created by translating temperature variations into visual contrast. Infrared systems are sensitive to environmental conditions. Clouds, humidity, and sunlight reflections can affect image quality. Objects that are not significantly warmer or cooler than their background may be difficult to distinguish. Distant targets can appear blurred or distorted. Camera angle and zoom level also influence perceived motion and size. The gimbal and go-fast recordings released to the public were captured using such infrared pods. Analysts later explained that apparent rotation or rapid movement in some clips could be influenced by camera mechanics, tracking modes, and relative motion between the aircraft and the target. These factors complicate interpretation when footage is viewed without full technical context. Naval vessels and ground stations provide additional sensor coverage. Aegis-equipped ships use powerful phased array radars capable of tracking hundreds of objects at long range. These systems are designed for missile defense and air surveillance. They continuously scan large volumes of airspace and generate extensive datasets. Ship-based radar systems face their own limitations. Sea clutter, weather systems, and commercial traffic produce dense backgrounds. Radar reflections from waves and vessels can overlap with aerial targets. Signal processing algorithms attempt to filter out noise, but some ambiguity remains. Electronic support measures detect emissions from radios, transponders, and radar systems. These sensors help identify cooperative aircraft and known platforms. Objects that do not emit recognizable signals appear only as passive radar or infrared tracks. This limits the ability to classify them quickly. Satellite-based sensors also contribute to situational awareness. Surveillance satellites monitor missile launches, large aircraft, and atmospheric events. However, their coverage is periodic rather than continuous. They may not capture short-duration incidents in specific training areas. All of these systems feed into data fusion software. Fusion systems combine inputs from multiple sensors to create a unified operational picture. This allows analysts to compare radar tracks, infrared images, and electronic signals. In theory, this improves identification accuracy. In practice, incomplete or conflicting data can still result in unresolved cases. Calibration and maintenance play a critical role. Radar and infrared systems require regular alignment and testing. Minor calibration errors can affect range estimates and tracking stability. Software updates may change how signals are processed and displayed. Differences between aircraft configurations can also affect recorded data. During training missions, sensors are often operating in specific modes optimized for exercises. These modes may prioritize certain types of targets and filter others. As a result, some objects may be detected only partially. When pilots later review recordings, the available data may reflect these operational settings rather than full-spectrum monitoring. Another factor is relative motion. A fast-moving aircraft observing a distant object creates complex geometric relationships. Apparent speed and direction depend on both the observer's motion and the target's movement. Without precise range data, estimates based on angular movement can be misleading. Environmental phenomena can also influence sensor readings. Weather balloons, drifting debris, ice crystals, and temperature gradients have all been documented as sources of unusual tracks. In some cases, multiple phenomena overlap, producing signals that do not match standard profiles. Military analysts reviewing UAP reports often focus first on sensor metadata. This includes timestamps, aircraft position, sensor mode, zoom level, and calibration status. Without this information, recordings and radar plots are difficult to interpret reliably. Many older reports lack complete metadata, limiting retrospective analysis. Advances in sensor technology have increased detection sensitivity. Newer systems can identify smaller and more distant objects. While this improves surveillance, it also increases the volume of ambiguous data. Objects that were previously invisible now appear as faint or intermittent tracks. The Department of Defense has acknowledged this trade-off in several public reports. Improved sensors lead to more reports, but not necessarily to faster identification. Analysts must sort through larger datasets with varying quality. Training programs now include guidance on documenting sensor settings and environmental conditions during unusual observations. Pilots are encouraged to preserve raw data when possible and to record contextual details immediately after landing. These practices aim to support later technical review. Despite these efforts, many recordings remain difficult to resolve. Publicly released clips represent only a small fraction of collected data. Most sensor files remain classified because they reveal system capabilities and limitations. For engineers and analysts, the primary challenge lies in separating genuine unknowns from artifacts of measurement. Every sensor system introduces distortions. Understanding those distortions requires detailed technical knowledge and access to raw data. The available public record shows that many UAP cases involve partial sensor information rather than clear images or tracks. The systems that capture these events are designed for combat and surveillance, not for documenting unexplained phenomena. Their outputs reflect that purpose. What remains consistent is the reliance on layered detection. Radar, infrared, electronic, and visual inputs are all considered together. Identification depends on how well these elements align. When alignment is incomplete, cases remain unresolved. When civilian air traffic and military data intersect, every flight conducted near the US coastline is logged, timed, and tracked through multiple civilian systems. Commercial airlines submit schedules months in advance. Private pilots file flight plans before departure. Air traffic controllers record position data continuously. These parallel records form a detailed map of routine movement in national airspace, one that military analysts rely on when reviewing unusual observations. When a Navy or Air Force crew submits a report involving an unidentified contact, analysts begin by retrieving civilian traffic records for the same time window. The Federal Aviation Administration maintains archives containing radar tracks, transponder broadcasts, and controller logs. These datasets allow investigators to reconstruct most civilian activity within a defined region. Modern commercial aircraft are equipped with Mode S or ADS-B transponders. These devices transmit aircraft identification, altitude, speed, and position several times per second. Ground stations and satellites receive these signals and feed them into air traffic management systems. When operating correctly, they make most civilian flights immediately identifiable. Many UAP reports are resolved at this stage. A radar return initially labeled unknown is matched to a delayed flight, a rerouted aircraft, or a private plane operating under visual flight rules. Temporary signal loss, equipment malfunction, or terrain interference can cause short gaps in tracking, creating brief periods of uncertainty. Not all civilian aircraft use active transponders at all times. Some older planes, gliders, and training aircraft are permitted to operate without continuous electronic identification in certain airspace. Military radar systems may detect these platforms, but without cooperative signals, classification becomes more difficult. High-altitude research platforms present another challenge. Universities, federal agencies, and private companies regularly launch balloons for meteorological and communications research. These vehicles can reach altitudes above 60,000 feet and remain airborne for days. Their slow drift and variable radar signatures sometimes resemble unconventional tracks. Data sharing between defense and civilian agencies is regulated through formal agreements. The Department of Defense maintains liaison offices with the FAA and NOAA. Authorized analysts can request detailed flight histories, radar plots, and weather data. Requests are logged and reviewed to ensure compliance with security and privacy standards. The FAA's Air Traffic Control System Command Center serves as a central hub for national traffic data. It stores historical movement records for commercial and general aviation flights. Analysts can access this information to determine whether reported anomalies coincide with scheduled operations, emergency diversions, or test flights. Another reference source is NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System. This database contains voluntary, anonymized reports from civilian pilots. Some submissions describe unexpected radar contacts, distant lights, or unidentified traffic. While these reports lack classified sensor data, they occasionally align with military observations in time and location. Offshore infrastructure also contributes to misidentification. Oil platforms, wind turbines, and large ships produce radar reflections and lighting patterns. Under certain viewing angles, these sources appear elevated above the horizon. Civilian maritime databases are consulted to verify vessel locations and platform activity. Unmanned aircraft have become increasingly relevant since the mid-2010s. Commercial drones are used for surveying, photography, and infrastructure inspection. Some long-endurance systems operate at higher altitudes than recreational models. Not all broadcast identification signals, particularly during early regulatory implementation. The FAA introduced remote ID requirements to address this issue. These rules mandate that many drones transmit location and operator information. Compliance has improved gradually, but gaps remain. Analysts often consult drone registration records and enforcement reports during case reviews. Temporary flight restrictions add another layer of complexity. Military exercises, space launches, disaster response operations, and high-level government travel result in short-term airspace closures. Civilian traffic is rerouted accordingly. Incomplete records during these periods can complicate later analysis. International aviation also affects coastal airspace. Transatlantic and transpacific routes bring foreign aircraft into US controlled regions daily. Their data is integrated into FAA systems, but detailed verification may require coordination with international authorities. Some UAP cases remain unresolved because civilian data is unavailable. Radar coverage is uneven in certain offshore and low-altitude zones. Equipment maintenance, system outages, and data retention limits can restrict historical access. In these situations, analysts must rely on partial records. Privacy restrictions further limit access. Law enforcement flights, medical evacuation aircraft, and corporate operations may have protected data. Authorization procedures can delay or prevent disclosure. This slows correlation efforts. Since 2020, technical integration between military and civilian systems has improved. Automated tools now compare sensor tracks with FAA databases in near real time. These systems flag likely matches and reduce manual workload. Older platforms, however, still require human review. Public government reports consistently note that civilian correlation resolves a large percentage of cases. Aircraft, balloons, drones, and maritime sources account for many initial unknowns. Remaining cases usually involve missing or degraded data. Civilian pilots occasionally submit reports resembling military observations. These include distant objects at cruising altitude or unexpected radar returns. Most are resolved through follow-up investigation using traffic and weather records. Coordination between agencies is now routine. Joint working groups, shared software platforms, and standardized procedures guide data exchange. These arrangements are reviewed regularly and updated as technology changes. Even with these systems in place, some incidents cannot be matched confidently. Timing discrepancies, sensor limitations, and incomplete records continue to affect analysis. Such cases are retained for further monitoring. For investigators, civilian aviation data establishes a reference frame. It defines expected activity patterns for a given region and time. Deviations from that baseline become the focus of review. Over time, this comparative process has become embedded in standard practice. Military observations are rarely evaluated in isolation. They are examined alongside civilian records, maritime data, and environmental information. Identification depends on how closely these sources align. When alignment is incomplete, uncertainty remains. How pilots are trained to report unusual encounters. Pilot training in the US, military places, strong emphasis on standardization. From initial flight school through advanced operational assignments, aviators are taught to observe, record, and report events using established formats. This applies to mechanical problems, weather, irregularities, near misses, and unfamiliar contacts. Reporting is treated as part of routine professional responsibility. During primary and intermediate flight training, student pilots are introduced to formal debriefing procedures. After each sortie, they review flight performance with instructors and intelligence officers. These sessions focus on navigation accuracy, communications, aircraft handling, and situational awareness. Any irregular observation is expected to be mentioned, even if it appears insignificant. As pilots progress to fleet squadrons, reporting requirements become more detailed. Operational units use standardized forms and digital systems to document safety-related events. These include hazard reports, aviation safety reports, and intelligence summaries. Unidentified aerial observations are incorporated into these existing frameworks rather than handled separately. Before 2015, guidance on reporting unusual aerial contacts varied by command. Some squadrons encouraged detailed documentation. Others treated brief mentions as sufficient unless a clear threat was perceived. Training materials did not always address unidentified phenomena directly. As a result, reporting practices differed between units. Following increased attention to UAP reports in the late 2010s, formal guidance was expanded. The Department of Defense issued instructions clarifying how aircrew should document anomalous observations. These instructions emphasized accuracy, completeness, and timely submission. Pilots were advised to record precise times, locations, altitudes, headings, and speeds. Sensor modes, weather conditions, and aircraft configurations were to be included when possible. Visual descriptions were encouraged to focus on observable features rather than interpretations. Speculation was discouraged. Training briefings began incorporating examples of past reports. These briefings explained how incomplete data limited later analysis. Instructors emphasized that even routine-looking details could become important when combined with other records. The goal was to improve the quality of submissions rather than increase their number. Simulator training also played a role. Advanced simulators allow pilots to practice identifying and tracking various aerial targets under controlled conditions. These scenarios include conventional aircraft, drones, balloons, and environmental artifacts. Exposure to these patterns helps pilots distinguish common sources of false or ambiguous signals. In squadron intelligence offices, designated officers are responsible for assisting with report preparation. These officers review sensor files, radar logs, and mission data. They work with aircrew to ensure that technical information is attached correctly. This process reduces errors and omissions. After 2020, the introduction of centralized reporting systems further influenced training. Online portals were created for submitting UAP-related observations. Pilots received instruction on how to access these systems and upload supporting files. Step-by-step procedures were included in squadron operating manuals. Recurrent training programs incorporated these updates. During annual safety stand-downs and refresher courses, reporting procedures were reviewed. Pilots were reminded of confidentiality protections and professional expectations. This was intended to reduce hesitation about submitting unusual observations. One issue addressed in training was concern about career impact. Some pilots had previously worried that reporting unexplained events might affect evaluations. Official guidance clarified that accurate reporting was valued and would not be penalized. Leadership communications reinforced this message. Medical and psychological evaluations were also considered. Flight surgeons and psychologists were briefed on reporting policies. Pilots reporting unusual observations were not automatically referred for medical review. This separation was intended to maintain trust in the reporting process. Debriefing culture evolved alongside formal rules. In many units, detailed discussions of sensor behavior and visual anomalies became more common. These discussions focused on technical explanation rather than speculation. Over time, this normalized reporting, Civilian-military coordination influenced training as well. Pilots were informed that their reports might be compared with FAA and NOAA data. Accurate timekeeping and position logging were emphasized to support this process. Wristwatch synchronization and mission clock checks became routine reminders. Flight manuals and tactical publications were updated to reflect new procedures. Sections on safety and intelligence reporting included references to unidentified phenomena. These documents outlined responsibilities at each level, from individual pilots to wing commanders. Instructor pilots received additional training. As mentors, they were expected to model proper documentation practices. They reviewed junior officers' reports and provided feedback. This reinforced consistency across experience levels. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office distributed guidance materials to training commands. These materials described preferred terminology and classification standards. They discouraged vague language and unsupported conclusions. Analysts requested clear descriptions of what sensors showed and what pilots saw. Over time, reporting became more integrated into normal workflow. Submissions were made alongside maintenance write-ups and mission summaries. Dedicated reporting sessions were incorporated into post-flight routines. The process became predictable. Despite these improvements, challenges remain. High-tempo operations leave limited time for detailed documentation. Sensor data may be overwritten or archived automatically. Memory fades quickly after complex missions. Training addresses these issues but cannot eliminate them entirely. Public testimony from pilots between 2022 and 2024 indicates that awareness of reporting pathways is now widespread. Most active duty aviators are familiar with submission procedures. They understand that unusual observations are routed through established systems. What training programs emphasize today is precision rather than interpretation. Pilots are taught to describe what was detected, how it was detected, and under what conditions. They are not asked to explain why it occurred, why some cases remain unresolved for years. When a report of an unidentified aerial observation is submitted, it enters a review process that is designed to be systematic and evidence-based. Analysts collect sensor data, flight records, environmental information, and intelligence references. In many cases, this process leads to a clear identification. In others, it does not. Some reports remain open for years, not because they involve extraordinary events, but because practical and technical limits prevent definitive conclusions. One of the most common obstacles is incomplete data. Many encounters occur quickly and unexpectedly. A pilot may notice a radar return for only a few seconds. An infrared track may appear briefly before fading. Visual contact may last less than a minute. If supporting sensors are not recording at high resolution, the available information may be minimal. Analysts rely heavily on raw files and metadata. When these are missing or degraded, analysis becomes difficult. Timing discrepancies are another frequent problem. Accurate identification depends on precise synchronization between different systems. Aircraft clocks, radar stations, satellite feeds, and air traffic control logs all operate on coordinated time standards. Small errors in synchronization can shift recorded positions by miles. If timestamps are inconsistent, correlating multiple data sources becomes unreliable. Environmental conditions further complicate interpretation. Weather systems influence both visibility and sensor performance. Clouds, humidity, temperature gradients, and atmospheric turbulence affect radar and infrared signals. In coastal regions, marine layers and inversion zones can create unusual reflections. When meteorological data is incomplete or generalized, analysts cannot always reconstruct these effects accurately. Sensor limitations are also significant. Each detection system has design constraints. Radar systems have minimum and maximum detection ranges. Infrared cameras depend on temperature contrast. Optical systems are limited by lighting and distance. Electronic sensors require active emissions. When an object falls outside optimal parameters, it may appear only partially or intermittently. Many unresolved cases involve single sensor detections. For example, a radar contact may appear without corresponding infrared or visual confirmation. An infrared signature may lack range data. Visual sightings may not be supported by sensor recordings. Multi-sensor confirmation greatly improves identification. Without it, uncertainty remains. Data preservation policies affect long-term analysis. Military sensor systems generate large volumes of information. Storage capacity is limited. Older files are often overwritten or archived in compressed formats. In some cases, raw data is deleted after routine retention periods. If a case is revisited years later, original files may no longer exist. Classification restrictions further limit review. Many sensor capabilities are classified. Details about detection ranges, processing algorithms, and vulnerabilities cannot be released widely. As a result, only cleared analysts can access certain datasets. This narrows the pool of experts who can review specific cases and slows external verification. Interagency coordination introduces additional delays. Some reports require data from multiple organizations, including the Department of Defense, FAA, NOAA, intelligence agencies, and foreign partners. Each organization has its own access rules and approval processes. Obtaining complete datasets can take months or years. International airspace adds complexity. When an incident occurs near national boundaries, foreign aviation authorities may hold relevant information. Sharing agreements vary by country. Political considerations, legal frameworks, and technical compatibility influence cooperation. In some cases, necessary records are unavailable. Human factors also play a role. Reports rely partly on pilot recollection. Memory is influenced by stress, workload, and time. During high-speed operations, attention is focused on mission objectives and safety. Details may be noticed but not fully processed. Later descriptions may differ slightly between crew members. Debriefing quality varies. Some squadrons conduct extensive post-flight reviews. Others operate under time pressure. When documentation is rushed, important details may be omitted. Analysts reviewing such reports years later cannot recover missing information. Technical interpretation evolves over time. Sensor artifacts that were poorly understood in earlier years may later be explained through improved research. However, older cases may lack sufficient data to apply new models. As a result, some files remain unresolved even after analytical advances. One example involves radar ghost tracks, which are false targets created by signal interference or processing errors. These phenomena are now better characterized than in the early 2000s. Yet many historical reports lack the raw signal data needed to confirm this explanation. Infrared systems present similar issues. Reflections from distant clouds, aircraft exhaust plumes, and temperature inversions can produce misleading images. Understanding these effects requires knowledge of sensor orientation, calibration status, and environmental context. Older cases often lack this information. Another limitation is the absence of independent witnesses. In some incidents, only one aircraft detects the anomaly. Without corroboration from other platforms, confidence in interpretation remains low. Multiple independent observations are relatively rare. Geographic coverage is uneven. Some training areas are monitored by multiple radars and satellites. Others rely on limited infrastructure. Incidents occurring in sparsely covered regions generate fewer data points. Resolution rates are lower in these areas. Operational secrecy affects documentation. Certain missions involve classified objectives. Sensor settings may be altered for tactical reasons. Details may be omitted from general reports. When incidents occur during such missions, analysts outside specific compartments may not have access to full context. Legal and policy constraints also influence long-term handling. Some data cannot be retained indefinitely because of privacy regulations. Civilian flight records, for example, have retention limits. Once these expire, historical correlation becomes impossible. Budgetary factors shape analytical capacity. Dedicated offices such as AARO have finite staffing and resources. Analysts must prioritize recent and high-impact cases. Older, unresolved reports may receive limited attention unless new information emerges. Congressional reporting requirements influence timelines. Public summaries are prepared on fixed schedules. Analysts may focus on compiling statistics rather than reopening individual cases. Detailed investigations continue internally, but progress may be slow. Public interest can affect case handling. High-profile incidents receive sustained review. Lesser-known reports may remain archived. This does not reflect their significance, but rather institutional workload management. Technological change creates compatibility problems. Older sensor formats may not integrate easily with modern analysis software. Converting legacy files requires specialized tools and expertise. Some formats become obsolete. Training turnover influences continuity. Analysts and intelligence officers rotate assignments. Institutional memory is fragmented. Without comprehensive documentation, new personnel may not fully understand earlier assessments. Reanalysis may duplicate previous efforts or overlook past findings. Some unresolved cases involve combinations of ordinary factors. For example, a distant commercial aircraft, partial radar coverage, atmospheric refraction, and timing errors may together create an ambiguous profile. Individually, each factor is manageable. Combined, they resist clear interpretation. Uncertainty thresholds vary. Analysts apply standards of confidence before closing a case. When evidence does not meet these thresholds, cases remain open. This reflects caution rather than indecision. In several public reports, AARO has emphasized that unresolved does not mean anomalous in a scientific sense. It indicates insufficient data. Many cases could likely be resolved if additional information were available. Historical reviews illustrate this pattern. Files from the 1950s through the 1990s contain numerous brief reports with limited documentation. Modern analysts often cannot reconstruct these incidents. They remain unresolved by default. Even recent cases may face similar outcomes. Despite improved sensors, some encounters still lack full coverage. Temporary equipment failures, weather interference, and operational constraints persist. Legal proceedings and oversight reviews can also delay resolution. When cases become part of investigations, access may be restricted. Analysts must wait for authorization. Reviews may be paused. Some reports remain open because new data occasionally appears. A later satellite pass, radar upgrade, or civilian report may shed light on earlier incidents. Keeping files open allows integration of future information. In practice, unresolved cases are periodically re-examined. Databases are updated. Correlation tools are improved. Analysts revisit older files when resources permit. Some cases are eventually closed. Others remain ambiguous. The volume of reports contributes to backlog. Hundreds of cases are submitted annually. Even with automated tools, thorough analysis requires time. Prioritization is unavoidable. Documentation standards continue to evolve. New guidance emphasizes preservation of raw data and detailed metadata. Over time, this may reduce unresolved rates. It will not eliminate them. Institutional caution also plays a role. Declaring a case resolved requires confidence that no significant factor has been overlooked. Analysts prefer uncertainty to incorrect attribution. Public transparency is limited by security concerns. Detailed explanations may exist in classified annexes. The public record shows only summary outcomes. This contributes to perceptions of unresolved mystery, even when internal assessments are more specific. Historical comparisons show that unresolved cases are not unique to UAP reporting. Aviation accident investigations, intelligence assessments, and surveillance analyses also contain files with inconclusive outcomes. Complex systems rarely produce perfect records. In operational terms, unresolved cases are treated as data points rather than anomalies. They inform training, sensor development, and reporting procedures. They highlight gaps in coverage and documentation. Over time, patterns may emerge from these cases. Recurring locations, conditions, or sensor configurations can be identified. For individual pilots, unresolved reports often have limited direct impact. Flights continue. Training proceeds. Few receive follow-up information. The case becomes part of institutional records. For analysts, unresolved files represent constraints rather than failures. They reflect the limits of observation in complex environments. Not every event can be reconstructed. The existence of long-standing unresolved cases illustrates the cumulative effect of small uncertainties. Missing seconds of data, minor calibration errors, incomplete weather records, and delayed reporting all contribute. As data systems improve, some of these constraints may diminish. Greater storage capacity, better synchronization, and enhanced sensor integration increase resolution potential. However, new technologies introduce new complexities. The record shows that unresolved cases persist across decades and platforms. They occur in different regions, under different conditions, and with different equipment. Their common feature is insufficient information. In official documentation, these cases are maintained with status codes indicating ongoing review or data limitations. They are not abandoned. They remain available for future reference. This long-term retention reflects institutional preference for caution. Closing a case without adequate evidence is avoided. Uncertainty is preserved rather than replaced with speculation. For oversight bodies, unresolved cases demonstrate the need for continued investment in data collection and analysis. They justify training, modernization, and interagency coordination. From a technical perspective, they mark the boundary between observable and interpretable phenomena. Sensors can detect more than analysts can always explain. The persistence of unresolved reports is therefore not exceptional. It is a predictable outcome of operating complex surveillance systems in dynamic environments. How international and allied reports are compared. Unidentified aerial observations are not confined to national borders. Military aircraft, naval vessels, and radar stations from different countries often operate in shared or adjacent airspace. Training zones, shipping routes, and surveillance regions frequently overlap. When unusual contacts appear in these areas, more than one nation may collect data related to the same event. The United States exchanges military aviation and surveillance information with allied countries through long-established defense agreements. These arrangements exist within NATO, bilateral security treaties, and regional partnerships. UAP-related data is handled through these existing intelligence and operational channels rather than through separate systems. When an incident occurs during joint operations or near international airspace, each participating country conducts its own review. Sensor recordings, flight logs, and mission reports are examined internally. Relevant findings are then shared through secure communication networks. Military attachés and liaison officers coordinate much of this exchange. During multinational exercises such as Red Flag, RIMPAC, and NATO air policing missions, data collection is centralized. Aircraft and ships from several countries operate under shared command structures. Radar tracks, infrared recordings, and communications logs are stored in joint systems. Unidentified contacts detected during these exercises are reviewed by multinational analysis teams. Historical cooperation in air surveillance dates back to the Cold War. Radar stations in North America and Europe routinely exchanged information to distinguish civilian aircraft from potential threats. These early systems established protocols that later evolved into modern data-sharing frameworks. Several allied countries maintain their own archives of unusual aerial observations. The United Kingdom collected reports through the Ministry of Defence until 2009, when its dedicated office was closed and files were transferred to the National Archives. France operates GUI-PAN under its National Space Agency, which publishes summaries of civilian and some military cases. Canada, Australia, and parts of Europe maintain similar records. Military-related observations in these countries are usually reviewed within defense ministries and shared selectively with partners. Public transparency varies. Some governments release detailed case files. Others publish only statistical summaries. After public attention increased in the United States following the release of Navy videos in 2017, several allied governments reviewed their own records. Some acknowledged that they had documented comparable radar tracks and visual sightings. Most emphasized that these incidents were evaluated using standard air safety and intelligence procedures. In 2022 and 2023, U.S. officials confirmed that AARO had consulted with foreign partners. These discussions focused on reporting standards, analytical methods, and data management practices. Specific case details were not made public. A major challenge in international comparison is technical variation. Countries use different radar systems, aircraft platforms, and processing software. Detection sensitivity, resolution, and filtering algorithms differ. Without detailed system specifications, it is difficult to compare sensor outputs directly. Legal frameworks also limit data exchange. Some nations restrict the release of raw surveillance data. Privacy laws affect access to civilian flight records. Classification rules determine who may review certain materials. These constraints reduce the amount of information that can be shared. Terminology differs across agencies. Phrases such as unknown track or unidentified contact may have specific technical meanings in one country and broader definitions in another. Efforts have been made to standardize language, but differences persist. Maritime regions require close coordination. Naval patrol zones often cross national boundaries. Multiple radar stations and surveillance aircraft monitor the same areas. When unusual contacts appear, partner navies exchange vessel positions, aircraft movements, and sensor data to rule out known sources. Space surveillance networks also contribute. The United States shares satellite tracking information with several allies through cooperative agreements. This data helps identify re-entering debris, satellites, and rocket stages that might otherwise appear as unexplained objects. Some cases are reviewed jointly when initial national investigations remain inconclusive. Analysts compare timelines, sensor readings, and environmental conditions. Additional perspectives sometimes lead to identification. In other instances, the same data limitations remain. Historical records present further obstacles. Older reports were often stored on paper or in outdated digital formats. Some files are incomplete. Converting these archives into searchable databases requires significant effort. As a result, long-term comparative studies are limited. Political conditions influence cooperation. During periods of diplomatic tension, information exchange may be reduced. In such cases, parallel investigations proceed with limited coordination. In the Asia-Pacific region, cooperation occurs through bilateral agreements and regional security frameworks. Japan, South Korea, and Australia share surveillance data with U.S. forces. Reports from these areas are evaluated within joint defense structures. Latin American countries such as Chile and Brazil have also maintained investigative offices. Some of their findings have been presented at international aviation conferences and shared through diplomatic channels. No centralized global database exists for unidentified aerial reports. Each country maintains its own systems. Comparison depends on voluntary participation and existing alliances. This decentralized structure limits comprehensive analysis. Publicly released government reports indicate that many internationally shared cases are resolved through conventional explanations. Balloons, drones, aircraft, and sensor artifacts appear frequently. Similar resolution patterns are observed across countries. Unresolved cases typically involve incomplete data, single sensor detections, or missing records. These limitations are common regardless of national context. International comparison does not always overcome them. Training programs for intelligence and aviation officers increasingly include multinational components. Analysts learn how partner nations collect and classify data. This improves coordination and reduces misinterpretation. In public statements, U.S. and allied officials consistently describe unidentified reports as operational and technical matters. They emphasize airspace safety and surveillance integrity. Speculative interpretations are avoided. Most detailed assessments remain classified. Public documents reflect only a portion of international cooperation. Behind closed systems, data continues to be exchanged and reviewed through established channels. Over time, coordination has become more structured. Reporting formats are being aligned. Secure communication systems are standardized. Joint analytical exercises are conducted periodically. International comparison expands the available information base, but does not guarantee resolution. When data aligns, cases are closed. When it does not, uncertainty remains. These cooperative mechanisms reflect practical defense requirements rather than investigative curiosity. They are designed to manage shared airspace and reduce operational risk. The existing record shows that unidentified observations are addressed through routine alliance structures. They are treated as shared technical problems, shaped by similar constraints in every participating country. What oversight committees and inspectors have found. Oversight of unidentified aerial phenomenon programs is conducted through established congressional and internal review mechanisms. These include standing committees in the House and Senate, inspectors general within federal agencies, and periodic audits by independent review offices. Their role is to evaluate compliance with law, funding use, reporting accuracy, and administrative performance. Congressional involvement increased after 2017, when previously classified Navy videos were publicly confirmed. Members of Congress requested briefings from the Department of Defense and intelligence agencies. These briefings were conducted in both classified and unclassified settings. Early sessions focused on how reports were collected, how data was stored, and which offices were responsible. In 2020, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence included language in its annual authorization bill requiring formal assessment of UAP reporting. This led to the creation of the UAP Task Force and later AARO. Subsequent legislation mandated regular reports and inspector reviews. These provisions established a recurring oversight cycle. Committees primarily examined three areas: reporting infrastructure, analytical capability, and financial management. Members requested documentation on staffing levels, database development, and interagency coordination. They also reviewed whether reporting systems were accessible to pilots and operators. One focus of oversight was whether earlier programs had been adequately supervised. Testimony and records related to AATIP and other small initiatives were examined. Investigators reviewed contracts, research expenditures, and administrative approvals. Public findings indicated that these programs operated with limited funding and narrow scope. In 2022 and 2023, several public hearings were held by the House Oversight and Accountability Committee and related subcommittees. Witnesses included former pilots, intelligence officials, and current administrators. These sessions focused on reporting barriers, data handling, and historical review efforts. During these hearings, committee members asked about classification practices. Officials explained that much sensor data remained restricted because it revealed military capabilities. Oversight bodies accepted this limitation while requesting greater clarity in public summaries. Inspectors General conducted parallel evaluations. The Department of Defense Inspector General initiated reviews of how UAP reports were managed and whether internal controls were adequate. These audits examined record-keeping practices, cybersecurity protections, and compliance with reporting deadlines. One Inspector General report published in 2023 noted that earlier reporting systems were fragmented and inconsistent. It found that some units lacked clear guidance and that databases were not fully interoperable. The report recommended standardization and improved training. Follow-up reviews assessed implementation of these recommendations. By 2024, oversight documents indicated that centralized databases had been established and that reporting pathways were more clearly defined. Some technical integration challenges remained. Financial oversight examined budget allocations. AARO's funding was reviewed annually through defense appropriations processes. Committees evaluated whether staffing and technology investments matched stated objectives. Public budget documents showed modest funding relative to other defense programs. Another area of concern was information retention. Oversight bodies asked how long sensor data and reports were preserved. Agencies provided retention schedules and described archival systems. Some older data had been lost due to legacy storage limits. Newer systems emphasized longer-term preservation. Oversight also extended to historical investigations. The 2024 AARO Historical Review was prepared partly in response to congressional direction. Committees examined how archives were searched and how interviews were conducted. They assessed whether appropriate records had been consulted. Public responses from oversight bodies were cautious. Reports emphasized that reviews had not uncovered evidence of unauthorized programs or concealed materials. They focused instead on administrative weaknesses and data gaps. Whistleblower protections were another subject of review. Legislation passed between 2022 and 2024 included provisions for individuals to report concerns related to UAP programs without retaliation. Inspectors General established confidential intake mechanisms. Several individuals submitted classified statements under these provisions. Oversight committees reviewed these submissions in closed sessions. Public summaries did not include details, citing security and privacy rules. Interagency coordination was examined repeatedly. Committees requested evidence of cooperation between the Department of Defense, FAA, NOAA, and intelligence agencies. Oversight reports indicated that formal liaison arrangements were in place, though information exchange remained uneven. Auditors also evaluated analytical capacity. They reviewed staffing qualifications, training programs, and access to technical expertise. Reports noted reliance on contractors and the need for continued professional development. Another recurring issue was public communication. Oversight bodies encouraged clearer explanation of reporting categories and resolution methods. Agencies responded by expanding methodological sections in annual reports. Oversight findings were typically incremental. Rather than identifying major misconduct, they documented procedural improvements and remaining limitations. Recommendations focused on documentation standards, data integration, and resource allocation. By fiscal year 2024, congressional reports described UAP oversight as part of routine defense administration. Programs were subject to the same auditing, reporting, and review processes as other intelligence activities. Special committees were not maintained solely for this topic. Internal evaluations within the Department of Defense continued alongside external oversight. Performance reviews assessed whether AARO met reporting deadlines and coordination targets. These evaluations were used for internal planning. Public access to oversight findings remained limited. Most detailed assessments were classified. Unclassified summaries provided general conclusions without technical detail. This reflected long-standing practices in intelligence oversight. The cumulative record from committees and inspectors presents a consistent picture. Reporting systems were initially fragmented. Centralization improved documentation and access. Technical uncertainty persisted. Funding remained modest. Administrative controls strengthened over time. No oversight report concluded that unidentified cases resulted from hidden programs or unmonitored activity. Instead, they emphasized incomplete data, technological limits, and organizational complexity. For legislators, the primary concern has been accountability rather than explanation. Oversight efforts focused on whether agencies followed law, protected data, and informed elected officials. Identification of specific objects remained a secondary issue. For agencies, oversight reinforced procedural discipline. Databases were maintained, reports were submitted on schedule, training was updated. The public record shows that review mechanisms functioned as designed. Committees questioned, inspectors audited, agencies responded, adjustments were made. The cycle repeated annually. As of the most recent reports, UAP programs operate within established oversight structures. Their activities are monitored through budget hearings, classified briefings, and internal audits. Findings are documented and archived. What remains unresolved are not administrative questions, but technical ones. Oversight bodies have addressed governance and compliance. They have not been able to resolve cases where data is incomplete. If this caught your attention, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more videos like this. Drop your thoughts in the comments and stay with us for the next investigation.